Ahead of a three-way meeting at Camp David, President Yoon says South Korea is open to separate consultations with the United States and Japan on extended deterrence. Vehicles apparently carrying athletes have been seen crossing from North Korea into China, a rare border crossing in well over 3 years since the COVID pandemic. Meanwhile, data show a sagging global chip industry led to a fall in South Korea's ICT exports last month. It's August 16, 2023. This is News Center. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. The three-way South Korea, U.S. and Japan summit is our top story. As the leaders are soon to meet at Camp David, the U.S. presidential retreat in Maryland, President Yoon says he is open to separate talks on extended deterrence with the two countries. And reports suggest the leaders could agree upon opening a three-way hotline as they seek to strengthen security cooperation. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Pae Eun-ji reports.
Before leaving for a landmark summit at Camp David later this week, President Yoon said he was open to separate consultations on extended deterrence among South Korea, the U.S., and Japan in a written interview with Bloomberg News. It reported Wednesday that President Yoon stressed the international community will never accept North Korea as a nuclear power under any circumstances, and that he expects the summit with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and U.S. President Joe Biden will lead to an agreement on ways to enhance their capabilities to respond to nuclear and missile threats from the North. Also ahead of this week's gathering, a virtual meeting between the top diplomats of the three countries was held on Tuesday night to discuss details of the summit. Seoul's foreign ministry said Minister Park Jin and his American and Japanese counterparts, Antony Blinken and Yoshimasa Hayashi, reaffirmed their nation's strong security cooperation regarding Pyongyang's nuclear and missile threats. Following the virtual meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken noted that the meeting at Camp David will mark a new era in trilateral cooperation.
And again, I don't want to get ahead of what will happen on Friday, but I think you'll see some very concrete measures that we're taking to enhance our capacity to provide for our security as three countries and also more broadly security in the Indo-Pacific region.
At the upcoming summit, the three countries are reportedly expected to launch a series of joint initiatives on defense and technology. Citing unnamed senior U.S. administration officials, Reuters said while the trilateral meeting is unlikely to produce a formal security arrangement, the leaders will agree to set up a three-way hotline to communicate in times of crisis. It also reported that the U.S. has formal collective defense arrangements in place with both South Korea and Japan separately, but it wants the two countries to work more closely together amid mounting concerns about China's growing power. In March, Seoul and Tokyo held their first bilateral summit in 12 years, as the Yoon administration has been working to restore ties with Japan by taking steps to ease tensions after years of historical disputes, including the issue of wartime forced labor during Japan's colonial rule of the Korean Peninsula, before and during World War II. Pae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
Two buses have been spotted crossing from North Korea into China, which sources say is likely to be athletes heading to Kazakhstan for a taekwondo event. Is this a sign Pyongyang more actively opening up its border after a long COVID lockdown? Our North Korean affairs correspondent Lee Jae-hyun has this report. Two buses were detected on Wednesday heading into North Korea from China and back again. Yonhap News reports that two buses departed Tandong at around 10:15 a.m., crossed a railway bridge over the Amnok River, and arrived in Sinuiju, North Korea. By 11:20 a.m., the buses had returned to Tandong 3 years and 7 months since the regime closed its border due to COVID-19. It's unknown who was on board, but multiple sources say it could have been athletes heading to the ITF Taekwondo World Championships taking place in Kazakhstan this week. Pyongyang earlier said that it will send about 100 athletes to the tournament. The North Korean team is expected to move to the Chinese capital city of Beijing on Wednesday and then fly to Kazakhstan after staying at the North Korean embassy. On Tuesday morning, a bus and a van were also seen in Sinuiju, crossing the border and returning to Tandong later. Sources say it was likely North Korean sailors who were arrested in China for smuggling. One expert says the resume in people exchanges had already been expected as delegations from China and Russia visited North Korea earlier to celebrate Pyongyang's Victory Day last month.
Whether or not this was related to the Taekwondo World Championships or not, more movement across the border is likely. People will be able to come and go freely in the very near future.
Some experts say there's a high possibility for a group of North Koreans who are residing in China to move back to their home country sooner. These people will likely include international students in China who haven't been able to come back to North Korea due to the pandemic. North Korea has stopped communicating with neighboring countries and closed its border in January 2020 at the start of the pandemic. But cargo train operations were spotted in January last year, and this year cargo trucks had also been spotted. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
The North Korean regime has spoken publicly about the U.S. soldier, Private Travis King, who ran across the DMZ into the north last month, saying he was seeking refuge from inhumane maltreatment and racial discrimination within the U.S. Army. Our Choi Min-jung explains what's behind the regime's intention.
North Korea has publicly shamed the United States for its human rights issues. The regime's state-run Korean Central News Agency reported Wednesday that Travis King, the U.S. soldier who dashed into the north last month, admitted that he illegally crossed the border due to what he called inhuman maltreatment and racial discrimination within the U.S. Army. This is the first public acknowledgement of the incident by North Korea. The KCNA also said the soldier expressed a willingness to stay in the north or in a third country. It seems highly likely that North Korea will use this incident to criticize Washington in response to the rising international criticism of its own human rights abuses.
North Korea is showing that it's dealing with human rights issues in a very transparent manner. It is also saying that the fundamental human rights problems the U.S. and the international community are talking about lie in the U.S., not North Korea.
North Korea's public confirmation of Travis King's status also comes ahead of Thursday's UN Security Council meeting on North Korea's human rights abuses. Pyongyang has voiced strong opposition to the meeting. Meanwhile, regarding the KCNA report, the U.S. Defense Department spokesman said Washington can't verify the comments and added that the U.S. remains focused on his safe return. The U.S. soldier dashed into the north on July 18th during a civilian tour of the joint security area on the heavily fortified border between the two Koreas. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
South Korea's ICT exports fell compared to last year as the semiconductor sector remains weak. A slowdown in the global economy is pointed out as one of the primary causes. Our An Sung-jin has the details.
South Korea's tech exports in July have seen an on-year decline for 13 consecutive months across most ICT products, including semiconductors, displays, and mobile phones. According to the Trade Ministry on Wednesday, South Korea's ICT exports for July stood at $14.6 billion, a 24.3% decrease compared to the previous year. This is largely attributed to a sluggish semiconductor industry. Semiconductor exports have seen a slump now for 12 consecutive months. The month of July saw a 33.7% on-year decrease at $7.5 billion. The relative decrease comes from a weakened demand for ICT devices.
With the decrease in demand, inventory increases, leading to a decrease in the unit prices. The slowdown in the global economy and China's economic growth are the major causes of the decrease in demand. This is expected to continue for a while as they cannot immediately change.
The base effect also played a major role as exports in July last year were at their highest for any month of July. A slowdown in the recovery also affected exports of displays and mobile phones. China takes up nearly half of South Korea's ICT exports, reaching 41.3%. Exports to China in July decreased by 27.7% on-year, while exports to Vietnam also fell by 18.6%, even though displays saw an increase. The US and Europe all saw a drop of more than 20%. Despite the overall drop in exports, the ICT industry maintained a positive trade surplus. In July, it was at $3.2 billion. As the slowdown of the economy continues, it is difficult to see when the ICT exports will bound back up again. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
President Yoon observes a 3-day mourning period for his late father, with condolence visits coming from across the political spectrum. The top office says his diplomatic schedule this week at Camp David won't be affected. Our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young tells us more.
State officials and former dignitaries, along with religious leaders, made their way to the funeral hall of President Yoon Suk-yeol's late father, Yoon Gi-jung. The top office on Tuesday said the late Professor Emeritus of Yonsei University had passed away, aged 92, and that President Yoon went to his side after attending the country's National Liberation Day event. The late Yoon Gi-jung taught applied statistics and was a respected figure in academia for his contribution and leadership. His son, the president, has fondly described him in the past as his #1 mentor and a man of principles. While the Yoon family are keeping the funeral a private affair, respectfully declining flowers and condolence visits, except from relatives and close acquaintances, a limited number of state officials and leaders in Korean society, including the religious sector, have paid their respects. This included Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, the leaders of the ruling and opposition parties Kim Ki-yeon and Lee Jae-myung, along with Deputy Prime Minister Lee Joo-ho and other cabinet members. Former President Lee Myung-bak also paid a visit and briefly held talks with President Yoon, as did former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who expressed his condolences and hopes that Yoon's upcoming trilateral meeting at Camp David would go well. A senior presidential official said that the president will observe the traditional 3-day mourning period and return to his duties on the last day to prevent any absence from conducting state affairs. Regarding Yoon's trip to the United States for the meeting at Camp David with his American and Japanese counterparts, the official said the departure time on Thursday may be adjusted, but the date remains unchanged. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Over in Hawaii, at least 100 people have died in the Maui wildfires, and officials worry that figures could double or even triple in the next 10 days. Park Go-nu with the details.
At least 101 people have reportedly lost their lives in the devastating wildfires in Maui. However, due to the scale of the operation, responders are struggling to search through the wreckage for human remains. As a result, Hawaiian Governor Josh Green, in a CBS interview that aired Monday, said that the death toll could double or even triple in the next 10 days. He added that 20 cadaver dogs and dozens of searchers are combing devastated blocks of the town of Lahaina on the island's west coast, where an estimated 10 to 20 bodies are being found each day. According to official estimates, 2,700 buildings were damaged or destroyed by the wildfires, with the cost of the damage coming in at an estimated $5.5 billion. To review recovery efforts in Maui, U.S. President Joe Biden said Tuesday that he'll travel to Hawaii as soon as he can.
My wife Jill and I are going to travel to Hawaii as soon as we can. I've been to too many disaster areas, but I want to go and make sure we got everything they need. I want to be sure we don't disrupt the ongoing recovery efforts.
Biden added that he's ordered all available federal assets on the island to assist local crews, including the U.S. Coast Guard, the Navy 3rd Fleet, and the U.S. Army. And for Maui residents, more police presence is what they may need, as Lahaina has seen the crime rate skyrocket after the wildfires. Locals have reported that looters have been pillaging the town at night, with some stealing people's possessions and robbing them at gunpoint. They've pointed to the lack of police and military presence in the area while calling for local leadership. To add to the problems, residents say supply vehicles containing shipments of water, food, and first aid items are being rerouted as authorities are barring access to the areas where help is most needed. Park Go-nu, Arirang News.
Two FA-50G fighter jets exported from South Korea's Seoul aircraft manufacturer, Korea Aerospace Industries, have successfully completed their first flights. KAI announced on Wednesday that FA-50G numbers 1 and 2 took off from Minsk Air Base in Poland and flew over the country's capital, Warsaw, to commemorate National Armed Forces Day there. A total of 12 fighter jets are scheduled to be delivered by the end of the year, with FA-50G numbers 3 and 4 set to be delivered sometime next month. The remaining 36 aircraft out of 48 purchased by Poland will be delivered from the latter half of 2025 through 2028. BTS member Jungkook has set another record for the K-pop industry, topping the Billboard global charts for the 4th consecutive week. Jungkook's debut single, 7, remains atop the Billboard Global 200 chart, according to data collected from over 200 countries, and also the Billboard Global chart, which excludes the United States. Ahead of Tuesday's chart announcement, Billboard stated that 7 has become the first song to be streamed over 100 million times in 4 weeks since the introduction of the Billboard Global chart in September 2020. South Korea's capital city, Seoul, on Wednesday unveiled its new brand slogan, Seoul My Soul. The slogan was chosen back in March via a month-long online vote. After that, from May to June, the city government went on to accept design submissions. A panel of experts selected the final design. This is the city's 3rd brand slogan, following Hi Seoul in 2002 and I Seoul You in 2015. It will be promoted through banners and advertisements on public transport across the city. Last week, China announced it has lifted its ban on group tours to South Korea and a slew of other countries after more than 6 years of restrictions. Related industries, including tourism and retail companies, are busy here, preparing to welcome tourists. For more on this, our business correspondent Shin Ha-young joins me in the studio. Hi, Ha-young.
Great to be back, Jung-min.
So Ha-young, China had restricted tour groups from traveling to South Korea since 2017. What has prompted Beijing to lift this restriction?
Well, as you've said, after almost 6.5 years, the Chinese government has given the green light for group tours to South Korea. And in fact, in an announcement made on Thursday, China's Culture Ministry lifted its ban on group tours to 78 countries, including the United States and Japan. And group tours to Korea were banned beginning in March 2017 in apparent retaliation against the deployment of the U.S.-made Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or the THAAD system. And one expert I talked to said there are diplomatic and economic reasons behind China's latest move. Let's take a listen.
I think we have to focus on the recent replacement of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China to Wang Yi. So China's stance is changing from a hard diplomatic strategy to a soft diplomatic strategy, in my opinion. So because China's domestic problems are surging, especially in the economic growth area, China has to seek economic cooperation with neighboring countries.
Regarding the timing, another expert I spoke with pointed out that China's decision came after U.S. President Biden ordered a ban on certain U.S. tech investments in China and ahead of the trilateral talks between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan scheduled for Friday.
Right, so more than 6 years for South Korea and some like 3 years for other countries. And then how are related industries reacting to this decision? What are some economic benefits that we can all look forward to?
Well, Jung-min, local businesses such as those in tourism, cosmetics, and even duty-free shops have welcomed the move. And they're expecting a recovery in sales, which were hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic and a drop in the number of tourists from China. Now, let's take a listen to what people had to say.
We are expecting sales to improve with more Chinese tourists. We are preparing a variety of joint promotions with tourism businesses and airlines to enhance the shopping convenience for Chinese tourists.
We have overcome all the challenges, including the period during the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope it provides an opportunity, especially for small business owners, to resume their operations.
Individual Chinese tourists have been able to travel to South Korea, but the big deal here about the tour groups is how much they spent. And data from the Korea Tourism Organization shows the number of Chinese tourists, which surpassed 8 million in 2016, was reduced by nearly half in 2017 due to the deployment of the U.S. missile defense system. Then the COVID-19 pandemic caused the number to plunge even further. And even though there has been some increase in the first half of this year, it is still at a very low level compared to the past. And with Beijing allowing group tours to resume, Seoul's travel deficit is one of the key areas that is expected to see a recovery. The country's travel balance during the first half of this year recorded a $4.65 billion deficit, the biggest deficit for the same period since 2018. And there has been a travel deficit for 22 consecutive years up to 2022. And South Korea could reach its 23rd year in the red if this trend continues. So all eyes are now on the Chinese tour groups. And according to a report released by the Bank of Korea, it is estimated that for every increase of 1 million Chinese tourists, South Korea's economy would grow by 0.08 percentage points. And this is a significant figure when considering the BOK's economic growth outlook for this year, which is at 1.4%.
Then can we expect the number of Chinese tourists and their spending recover to the level of 6 years ago?
Well, to give you a straight answer, no. It would be difficult to see that much recovery immediately. In fact, an expert I spoke to mentioned the potential for an improvement in South Korea's travel deficit, but transitioning to a surplus remains uncertain as Chinese consumer behavior has changed since then.
Japan is one of the preferred travel destinations for Chinese tourists. This is due to its proximity, strong preference for Japanese products, and the depreciation of the Japanese yen. As the cost of living in China is low, it is dealing with deflationary concerns, while South Korea is experiencing relatively high inflation. Therefore, for Chinese tourists, the perception of the cost of living in Korea is relatively higher.
In response, the government and local authorities have taken swift action to attract Chinese tourists. The Ministry of Culture, Sports and Tourism plans to roll out various strategies, including launching a K-Tourism Roadshow event in Shanghai, targeting Chinese holidays, including its Mid-Autumn Festival and National Day. And after allowing group tours in just one day on Friday, reservations were made for a total of 53 Chinese cruise ships to visit Jeju, meaning that more Chinese tourists are expected to visit South Korea from now on.
All right, thanks for your reporting, Hayoung.
Always my pleasure.
The capital region will see similar weather pattern persisting for the next few days. Highs will be staying around the 32-degree mark along with on and off showers, and sensible temperatures will be higher than the actual readings. For those working outdoors, please take extra precautions against heat-related illnesses. Unstable atmospheric conditions will produce sudden showers across much of South Korea tomorrow. For parts of central regions and Jeollado province, 5 to 40 millimeters are expected. Gyeongsang-do province has 5 to 60 millimeters in the forecast. Despite the showers and increasing cloud coverage, UV radiation will be intense nationwide. Most regions will see UV ray index in the high to very high range. Even under partly cloudy skies, you can still be sunburned by strong UV radiation. Make sure to wear your sun protective items. Tomorrow, Seoul and Busan will be starting off at 24 degrees Celsius. Daytime highs will be in a similar range tomorrow. Seoul will peak at 32, Daejeon 31, Gyeongju will be topping out at 30 degrees. And for the time being, many inland regions, including Seoul, will see hot spells along with tropical nights. That's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is News Center for tonight. Thanks for watching. A panel session coming up.
하나, 둘, 셋.
Hey, Mr. Cupid, who's lying? Make sure you listen to what I say. I may be stupid or quite naive.
끝없이 쏟아지는 포토스팟. 휴대폰 한 대로 감당할 수 있겠니?
Arrow straight through my heart.
I'm Yasmin Dalila Amriswet, the ambassador of the Republic of Rwanda to the Republic of Korea. Since I've been in Korea, I've heard and learned a lot from Arirang TV, and I'm very thankful. Arirang TV has been a very good media diplomacy partner, and I've learned a lot through the content and the programs. Korea has been shining, and I've been having this feeling and this perception thanks to the content and the work of Arirang TV. I look forward to see Arirang TV continue to take the lead in this in giving the world Korean information about the culture, the IT information, and everything surrounded it, resonating with the world. Arirang.
Feel so good right now. Maybe I had a drink or two, but this somehow feels like it's forever. All my friends are here having fun and feeling good, but right now, maybe this is forever.
Lotte takes a new leap beyond its boundaries. Our change will lead to better lives for all. New Lotte, the power of a better world. New today, better tomorrow. Lotte.
Wake up. 엄청난 에너지를 춤으로 뿜어내는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니? 한국에 오면 먹어야죠. 먹어도 끝이 없는 나라. 감당할 수 있겠니?
Hello everyone, it's Wednesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. A trilateral summit between Seoul, Washington and Tokyo is scheduled to take place soon, as is a key joint military exercise between South Korea and the U.S. Prior to such big upcoming events, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un reportedly spent 2 days visiting major factories producing tactical missiles and launch systems, less than a week after a 3-day visit to other arms manufacturing facilities. So how are Seoul, Washington and Tokyo going to enhance their cooperation, and what will be North Korea's reaction? For an in-depth analysis, we have invited Dr. Go Myung-hyun, a senior fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, into the studio. Dr. Go, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
And we also have Professor Brian Myers from Dongsa University. Good to see you, Professor Myers.
Good to see you too.
All right, now first question to our Dr. Go. So North Korean leader Kim Jong-un made another series of visits to arms facilities, and this came less than a week after he paid a 3-day visit to another major arms factories. Are such visits usual?
Oh, it's definitely usual for a leader of a country like North Korea. It's really a country about military first policies. So it's even if there's no contingency in North Korea, a North Korean leader will be paying visits to weapons manufacturing facilities. But in this case, I think Kim Jong-un is trying to send multiple messages at the same time. So there are, first of all, the weapons development roadmap that Kim Jong-un set out in 2021. And then so Kim Jong-un probably wants to show off to the rest of the world that his plan to develop and then upgrade North Korea's conventional nuclear capabilities are on schedule. There's that. And also there's a message to South Korea and the United States showing that despite all the internal and external pressure that the regime is facing, North Korea has no problem increasing its level of threat. And thirdly, I think another factor that's in the background is the upcoming joint military drills, the scheduled military drills between South Korea and the United States, and especially the fact that Kim Jong-un visited a missile manufacturing factory, and also as other relevant munitions factories, show that Kim Jong-un might be setting the ground to test or carry out exercises involving those tactical missiles.
Right, so there were many messages that Kim Jong wanted to send. Professor Myers, this also came after Kim presided over an enlarged meeting of the Central Military Commission of the ruling Workers' Party last Wednesday, where he urged for preparations for offensive military action in case of a possible war. Now, what does he mean by offensive action, and how did you see the meeting?
Well, Bo-kyung, a lot of people hear the term offensive in a military context, and they think it means the start of a war or a conflict by an aggressing power. But in fact, it can mean any kind of initiative undertaken to achieve a strategic goal during a conflict. So you can undertake offensive actions even if you're fighting a defensive war. So even though Kim Jong-un was recently photographed in front of a banner saying, let's sweep away the South Korean puppets, you guys just showed that photograph a few moments ago, his statement about preparing offensive actions does not necessarily mean that he's preparing an out-of-the-blue attack or invasion like the one with which his grandfather started the Korean War in 1950. I think that needs to be said because some of the media reports have been a bit too hyperbolic. On the other hand, offensive actions can refer to pretty much any sort of strike on enemy positions or enemy territory, and that can include those tactical missiles that Dr. Go just mentioned. But in the photograph of the meeting, Kim Jong-un was shown quite ostentatiously pointing at Seoul and Daejeon on a map. And this makes me think that the meeting and the statements that Kim made were conceived as much for external as for domestic consumption, because in this way, the tension on the peninsula is made to appear to be increasing, and that always heightens pressure on the Americans and the South Koreans to take a softer line in their relations with North Korea.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Myers, so Dr. Go mentioned the joint military exercise as one of the reasons why North Korean leader Kim Jong-un made, a series of visits to major factories and also making such remarks. Now, delving a little bit deeper into the military exercise, what is expected during this Ulti Freedom Shield, which runs from the 21st to the 31st, and what are other allied field training events we could be able to see?
Well, these are supposedly defensive exercises in which the alliance simulates the protection of South Korea from external attack. So they are computer-based, yes, but they're pretty large-scale training events with, twice as many field training exercises as usual. And it involves Americans and South Korean units with other UN command member states like, Canada in secondary augmenting roles. And apparently, the interesting thing is that these exercises are going to reflect insight gained from the ongoing war in the Ukraine. But, just as a country fighting a defensive war can engage in offensive tactics, a country fighting a war of aggression can also engage in defensive tactics. So even though these exercises have the word shield in their name, and even though they're supposed to be very benign, I think we need to understand that from a North Korean perspective, they do perhaps look like rehearsals for a war of aggression. So my point really is that neither side is contributing to a reduction of tensions right now.
Right, I see. Now, Dr. Go, for the first time ever, the U.S. Space Force, a branch within the U.S. military responsible for global space operations, will take part in the exercise as well. What does that hint at?
Well, actually, the U.S. Space Force has been participating in the defense of South Korea for a while now. In fact, there's an official detachment of the U.S. Space Force based station in South Korea right now. It's called the Space Force Korea. So, and then at the same time, the reason why the Space Force participation, not just in the joint military drills, but overall defense plan of the United States for South Korea is not unusual, is because the Space Force is not really about defending, say, like the external threats using space vehicles and all that. In fact, the job of the Space Force, as we know, is to manage and protect the remote sensors that are based in space. Essentially, these are satellites. So because in the modern warfare, the militaries of not just the United States, but any advanced militaries rely increasingly on the space-based communication networks, as well as the sensors based in space. The role of the Space Force has become very important. So, for instance, whenever North Korea launches a ballistic missile towards Japan or towards South Korea, it's the space-based assets of the United States, essentially the Space Force, that are observing the trajectories of these missiles. And if there's a contingency in the Korean Peninsula and say that North Korea indeed prepares to attack South Korea or Japan with ballistic missiles, then it will be the job of the Space Force to detect these launches beforehand so that the other branches of the U.S. and South Korean militaries can react. So that's the role of the Space Force. And this is a reflection of the fact that the United States is trying to implement a new military doctrine called multi-domain operations. And the multi-domain here refers to not just the three traditional geospatial domains of air, land, and sea, but also includes now the electromagnetic spectrum, cyberspace, as well as space. So, and then these are essentially very multi-layered, multi-domain operation framework that the United States military is trying to implement right now. So it's only natural for the Space Force of the United States to participate in the joint military drills.
Right, so military cooperation is becoming more comprehensive.
Exactly.
Right, I see. Now, moving on to the trilateral summit that is going to take place at Camp David this week, Dr. Go. According to the Wall Street Journal, part of the three countries' agenda is going to include the discussion on training for tracking and destroying the ballistic missiles using radar, satellite, and weapon systems. Now, what are the joint military exercises between three countries like right now, and what does this change mean?
This is again, it's more about officializing this kind of joint military drills or security cooperation between Korea, Japan, and the United States. In fact, only last month, the navies of Korea, the Naval Self-Defense Force of Japan, and the U.S. Navy have conducted a joint military drills where they indeed did exactly what your question has outlined, trying to detect and then follow the trajectory of a North Korean ballistic missile. So in that sense, I think these kind of exercises have been in place, and then what the three countries are trying to do right now is to normalize such cooperation, because as we all know that there's a lot of, I would say, resistance to the idea of Korea, Japan cooperating in the defense matters, in South Korea especially. And I think especially the United States wants to use the symbolism of a trilateral summit taking place in a historical space such as Camp David to normalize this kind of security cooperation between Korea and Japan going forward. So many of the agenda items that are included in the summit, where they're going to discuss this kind of joint military drills between Korea and Japan and the United States, are already being carried out. So it's more about sending a message and to especially the Korean audience, that this is a normal procedure going forward, because now Japan has always been part of the important component of the defense of South Korea, and now United States and South Korea want to show to the South Korean public that this has always been the case and will be the case going forward. Therefore, normalize the role Japan has in defense of South Korea.
Right, so it's all about institutionalizing.
Exactly.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Myers, so speculation is also high that the three countries may hold trilateral meetings on a regular basis, with the media outlets saying that the countries' officials of NSC will meet at least once a year. And they're also expected to set up a so-called crisis hotline. Now, what do such measures hint at?
Well, any high-ranking meetings like that or summits between the leaders are always going to be, I think, primarily symbolic events, because the real work is done by people lower down on the totem pole. And trilateral summits with the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the American leaders would be no different, although I think the symbolizing of fraternity and cooperation would be especially significant here, as Dr. Go says, because of the historically troubled relationship between the Japanese and South Koreans. And precisely because of that history, I think these displays of cooperation are going to arouse a lot more controversy here in South Korea than in Japan. And the chairman of the opposition party here in South Korea, Lee Jae-myung, has just expressed very strong criticism of any sort of military partnership between the two countries. And that's significant because it indicates what the Americans are afraid of, namely that a change in government would mean the end of cooperation, would mean everything going back to where it was. So the summits, I do think, are designed to habituate the South Korean public, to get the South Korean public used to the idea of working together with Tokyo. And I think that also explains why President Yoon made such strongly pro-Japanese remarks yesterday on a national holiday, which is usually reserved for nationalist, if not Japan-bashing rhetoric. So if the three leaders or their national security advisors can meet regularly and often over the next 3 or 4 years, it'll be harder, or so the Americans hope, for a new South Korean president to go back to the sort of anti-Japanese posture that we saw from the Blue House during the Moon Jae-in administration.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Myers, this just popped up in my mind. We know that there are some lingering issues between Seoul and Tokyo, for example, the release of the Fukushima wastewater. But how do you believe such issues should be dealt with for the two countries to move forward?
Well, that's a tough question. It's kind of a minefield for an American to enter, because the feelings, the emotions are so high on both sides. But I do tend to agree with the narrative that it's really in South Korea's interests to cooperate more closely with Japan. Now, here, there are many people who believe that this would mean a loss of sovereignty for South Korea. But I think, on the other hand, that if Japan and South Korea can put aside their differences, they can probably assert themselves more effectively vis-a-vis the Americans.
Right, I see. Now, Dr. Go, staying on the trilateral summit front. So, first Deputy Director of National Security, Kim Tae-ho, he said that the three countries will launch multiple consultative bodies, not just in the fields of military sharing, information sharing, but also on AI, cybersecurity, and economic security as well. How do you see this?
Well, I think it is essentially a natural extension of the alliance deepening that the United States is trying to carry out, not just with Korea, but also with Japan. So I think in a way, what the Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Tae-ho is pointing at is that the trilateral security cooperation between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington is going to also become comprehensive. So, but then I think this is exactly the reason why I'm looking forward to reading the joint statement that will be issued after the trilateral summit in Camp David on August 18th, because I think it's going to be essentially the repetition of the joint statements that United States have issued with Korea and Japan respectively in the last 2 years. So it'll be pretty much the same message, but then the only difference being this time that there's a mention of the trilateral cooperation between Korea, Japan, and the United States. So in that sense, I think this is essentially the evolution of the alliance architecture that the United States is trying to have in Northeast Asia. So at the same time, this is the echoes of the AUKUS agreement that Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States have reached a couple of years ago. So AUKUS started out primarily as a military cooperation in a narrow sense to build nuclear submarines for Australia based on the partnership between not just including Australia but also the United Kingdom and the United States. We are seeing echoes of that in this trilateral alliance between Korea, Japan, and the United States. So essentially, this is going to be another unilateral alliance or unilateral mechanism that, unlike what the President Yoon has said, so it's rather than being a mini NATO, I think it's going to be more like an AUKUS for Northeast Asia. So we're going to see, if the United States expectation plays out, then I think we're going to see a lot of deepening of the relationship and cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo going forward.
Right. Now, Professor Myers, I'd like to also tap on the responses from other countries as well. Now, the official said the joint statement will explicitly mention North Korea, while it will not use language targeting China. What kind of provocative actions might we expect in turn from Pyongyang?
Well, Pokyung, I don't really like the word provocations in this context because it creates the impression that North Korea's main interest is in sort of sporadically poking its enemies to try to get some sort of reaction out of them, when in fact, Pyongyang has been carrying out a nuclear program for decades that has its own internal technological timetable, albeit conditioned by external variables like the weather and the behavior of North Korea's enemies. But if you're asking what we're going to see from North Korea on the nuclear ballistic front in the near future, I would say we're going to see what we saw in 2020, which was an exceptionally high number of missile launches, ranging from short-range missiles designed to hit South Korea, mid-range missiles conceived to hit Japan, and ICBMs that are, of course, intended to reach the United States. Now, remember, Kim Jong-un has pledged to exponentially increase missile production. So I think he needs a comparable number of launches this year if he wants to look like he's serious about that pledge. Now, of course, the big technological goal for the North Koreans, as always, is to miniaturize a nuclear weapon that can fit on a missile or to show convincing evidence to the outside world of that kind of a capability. So that's the outlook, I think, for the year ahead. And unfortunately, it's not a very rosy one from the alliance's perspective.
Right. Now, Professor Myers, we cannot leave out China's reaction. And China has been criticizing the Camp David summit, calling it is an attempt to create a mini NATO, as our Dr. Go previously mentioned. Could you tell us details on how China is viewing this summit?
Well, China has a certain point. Let's not forget that the Japanese wanted to open a NATO office in Tokyo. I think there are certain legitimate fears of encirclement that the Chinese are naturally going to feel when they see the Americans and the South Koreans and the Japanese joining hands in what is beginning to look like a de facto military alliance and conducting military exercises on China's doorstep. So I don't think that's unreasonable bluster on the part of the Chinese. Now, we in the West, we don't like it when Russia and China and North Korea join hands. That makes us feel threatened. And I think it's only natural for this budding trilateral partnership to make the Chinese a bit worried too.
Right, I see. Now, Dr. Go, before I let you go, I'd like to ask you this last question. So, Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo have requested a UNSC meeting to jointly discuss human rights issues in North Korea. And if this does go ahead, it will be the first time since 2017. Does that have any special intention behind?
No, I think it reflects the fact that the human rights situation in North Korea is worsening, which is very surprising because it's already very bad. And the reason is because North Korean people have been subject to ever-increasing oppressive measures by the regime due to the pandemic control measures, but also as the effort by the regime to control the spread of South Korean dramas and even like South Korean linguistic expressions, which are punishable by death if you are found using, say, like practicing South Korean expressions.
Right.
Despite the fact that North Korea and South Korea share the same language. So this extreme form of oppression that we are seeing and have been officialized and even institutionalized by the North Korean regime is a source for a grave concern, clearly. And we have to remember again that this marks the 10th year of the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry of a North Korean human rights situation. So the Commission of Inquiry issued a landmark report saying that characterizing the human rights situation in North Korea as being grave, systematic, and widespread. We are seeing that in the 10 years since the COI, DPRK has issued a landmark report, the situation in human rights situation in North Korea hasn't improved at all, has only worsened. So I think it's only natural for the three countries that are biggest stakeholders in seeing the improvement of the human rights situation in North Korea to get together and then essentially emphasize the urgency of human rights situation in the country.
Right, I see. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Dr. Go, as usual, for your time and insights. And thank you, Professor Myers, for your insights and time as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.
Welcome